Sorry if my voice is a little gravelly this morning. I'm having just a little bit of an allergy issue this morning. All right. On Easter Sunday, you may recall that we looked at John 3:16 and how Jesus didn't come to condemn the world, but he came to save it. Last week, we looked at the parable of the lost sheep and how much effort Jesus goes to seek out his lost children. We also looked at how personal that was. We are not a number to Jesus. He doesn't have to stop and count to see if someone is missing. He knows our name and he knows what we're going through, and he seeks us out when we are lost. Today I want to look at the story from Luke, which has sort of a similar theme. We see the great personal care of Jesus in this passage. He is not uncaring for our needs. Now, what's interesting is coming into Easter, I felt like, normally I preach in a series, and I haven't been in a series for a little while, but coming toward Easter, I felt like the Lord asked me to just preach standalone messages that focused on the person of Jesus and would help us love Jesus more. So the last 3 weeks, I've just been focusing on Jesus and the characteristics of Jesus that endear us to him. Now here, starting in Luke chapter 8, verse 40, we see two miracles, and one miracle is actually interrupted by the other. In the process of the first miracle, the second miracle comes and interrupts it. And the two characters in these stories are unlikely characters, a synagogue ruler and an unclean woman. All right, starting in verse 40, let me read it through and then we'll take a look at it. Luke 8:40. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue ruler, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his home, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman who was there, who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her, she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at Jesus' feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." So the story picks up in verse 40. Jesus and his disciples, they've crossed back over the lake. They're on the other side now, but they're still near the Sea of Galilee. The crowd is eager to see Jesus, and they welcome him warmly. But this stands in contrast to the crowd that Jesus just left on the other side of the lake after he healed a man with a legion of demons. Do you remember that story? Jesus goes out into the cemetery. There's a man with a legion of demons. He delivers that man from all the demons. He tells him to go into the pigs. The pigs rush down the hill and they all die, right? Well, at the end of that scene, the people in that area are so fearful, they ask Jesus to leave. So he got in his boat with his disciples, and he comes across the lake, and now we're picking up here. So do you see the contrast? That crowd asked Jesus to leave. This crowd warmly greets Jesus. Verse 41. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house. Now this is interesting because not every religious leader has rejected Jesus. Most are. Most of the leaders are trying to figure out how to get rid of Jesus. But Jairus comes and he falls at Jesus' feet. Now, obviously Jairus could look at Jesus and see that God must be using him. And so he saw something of God in Jesus. And so he goes against all the other leaders and he comes to Jesus. What's interesting is in the original language, the word that's translated into English as leader suggests that he was the main leader at the local synagogue. So he was probably the highest leader of that local synagogue. And yet he comes and falls at Jesus' feet. So Jairus was clearly a man of standing in the city, and he has a lot to lose by coming to Jesus. And his name, Jairus, means he will give light. Isn't that interesting? He's the only one of the religious leaders that comes to Jesus, and his name means he will give light. So he's giving light to the others who will watch him. Now, the fact of the matter is that his only daughter is sick, and so he reaches out to Jesus, despite what the other leaders may be saying about Jesus. Jairus shows respect by falling at Jesus' feet, an act of significance for a person with such high standing. This right here almost discredits Jairus now amongst all the other religious leaders. because he fell at Jesus' feet. Verse 42. Because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. So here Luke gives us a few important details. It's the leader's only daughter. The girl's about 12 years old. And what's interesting, in a minute, the woman with the flow of blood, she had been sick for 12 years. We can't read too much into that. I think it's just interesting. But as far as Jairus' daughter, at her age, in this time period, in the time period that this is happening, a girl of 12 would have been approaching marriageable age and entering into the quote-unquote prime of her life. And so Jairus, obviously it's his own daughter, he's concerned, but this is the beginning of adult life in that time period. Now, in the original language, the word dying here actually has the feel of beginning to die. So we can look at the grammar from the Greek and assume that the girl has been sick for a while, but now is actually beginning to die. And so Jairus comes to Jesus and says, my only daughter is beginning to die. Jesus agrees to go, but the crowds are pressing him. The fact that Jesus agrees to go is almost lost, isn't it, in the way Luke presents it? As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. Jesus doesn't actually say, okay, I'll go. Luke just records that he is going. He went. Jesus, in his gracious compassion, goes with Jairus, and he's fighting this massive crowd. Jesus could see Jairus' pain, even though the leader could have been seen as an enemy. Think about this for a minute. Jesus probably knows that this guy Jairus is the leader of the local synagogue. Jesus knows that all of the leaders are out to get him, and yet when Jairus comes and says, help my daughter, Jesus doesn't hesitate, and he goes with a potential enemy to go heal his daughter. He does not hold back from going with Jairus. This sort of adds to the drama of the story, and I have a feeling it brought confusion to the crowds. Because the people in the crowd, they recognized Jairus as a synagogue ruler, and they knew that all the other leaders were opposed to Jesus, and yet now they see Jesus going with Jairus. The rest of the crowd's probably going, who is this Jesus? The verb that Luke uses here to say that the crowds are pressing him is the same verb used back in the parable of the seeds to say that the thorns are choking the good seed. Remember the parable of the sower and the seed, right? And some of the seed fell amongst thorns, and the thorns choked out the good. That's the picture that Luke paints here. It's like the thorns were choking out the good seed. The crowd is almost choking out Jesus. It's so intense. So this must have been quite a throng of people in a chaotic scene. Verse 43. And a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. So now this woman with a flow of blood for 12 years comes and appears into the scene. Luke concludes this. Again, interesting that she's had her issue for the same number of years as Jairus' daughter is old. Now, for this woman, we have to understand this. In our day and age, in our mind, it's a little hard to understand what this woman went through. For this flow of blood would have made this woman continuously unclean, and it would have been the source of continual embarrassment affecting her ability to live a normal life. Anyone else who touched her would have become unclean. This would have meant that she probably would have lost her husband and any children that she had. Even if she sat on a chair, the chair would become unclean, and no one else could then sit in that chair. This would have meant that she probably would have had to have lived alone. She would have been strictly forbidden from going to the temple for any kind of worship, so she couldn't engage in the normal societal worship at the temple. People would have avoided her in public. If they saw her coming in public, they would cross to the other side of the street just to avoid any accidental touching or brushing up against her, because that would have made them unclean. So this woman would have been completely ostracized and avoided in public. This would have been like if she had leprosy, because leprosy was just wildly contagious, but she was unclean, so they would have just avoided her like crazy, avoided anything that she touched. Excuse me. She would have lived a very lonely and fearful life. This is probably why she sneaks up to try to touch Jesus. She was afraid that Jesus would reject her as the crowds would, and that if anyone saw her, they would shoo her away from Jesus. So she's approaching him from behind to try to be discreet because she knows that she can't be around people and she can't be seen. Mark also mentions, when we see this story in the book of Mark mentions that she spent all of her money on doctors. So that sort of added to her woe. She probably now has severe financial problems. Verse 44. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. The woman approaches Jesus from behind, again, to try to avoid some sort of a public spectacle. The term the term that Luke uses here is a medical term for the stoppage of blood. Now remember, Luke was a doctor, and so it's not uncommon for Luke to use medical terms. And he uses a medical term here to say that her bleeding immediately stopped. The years of agony were over in an instant. This shows us the power that is always in and at work in Jesus. We can still do this today, right? Years ago, I prayed for a woman with fibromyalgia. Now, fibromyalgia is a very serious and chronic illness. I prayed for her right in the back corner, kind of where that hand sanitizer station is. I prayed, again, fibromyalgia, she'd had it for a long time. I put my hand on her shoulder, I prayed for her, and instantly, just instantly, she was healed. Years of fibromyalgia just gone in a blink, just gone, like that. Prior to me praying her, she could barely walk. She had a hard time making it from her chair over to where I was standing. After I prayed for her, she took off and started running laps around the building, screaming hallelujah. She's just running laps around the building, and just in an instant. So Jesus still has this same power in him today, right? But we're going to get to something that's a little bit more important in this passage in a minute. But here we see the first healing is now interrupted by a second healing. So Jesus is on his way to go see Jairus' daughter who's about to die. And on the way there, bam, another miracle. Someone else gets healed. Verse 45. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. And earlier, Luke had said it was almost like they were choking him, right? It was like the thorns choking the good seed. So this is a crazy throng of people that are all around Jesus. And he stops and he asks, who touched me? And even though she's already healed, Jesus knows she's healed, right? Jesus stops. I think this is the important thing. This is what I want you to see about Jesus today. Jesus, the power that's within Jesus, has already healed the woman. He knows that, and yet he stops because he wants to interact with this woman. Jesus probably already knew who it was who had touched him. I'm sure he could have pointed her out, but he wants the woman to make a confession. Jesus wasn't looking for her to confess so that he could further embarrass her, but so that he could build her faith and restore her. He already sees her pain. But yet in this scene, Peter is amazed by the question. How can Jesus ask such a question? The people are crowding and pressing against it, says in this verse. Here's what's interesting. These words in the original language, the first word that's translated as crowding, in the original language means holding prisoners in a jail or locked in a siege. This crowd is so intense that Luke is painting the picture as if Jesus is being held in siege or in jail by the crowd. Then the second word that's translated as pressing against is typically the word used to press grapes for making wine. So that's how chaotic this scene and this crowd was, is that it feels like Jesus is being held in restraint like jail and being pressed as if they were making wine. But Jesus could feel the difference in the touch of the woman. Don't ever think that Jesus doesn't notice you or see your pain. I also think that Jesus knew the emotional condition of the woman, and that's why he wanted to stop to talk to her, so he could set things right there as well. Remember, this woman had no life. She had no normal life. Verse 46. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. So Jesus presses on with his line of questioning to try to find this woman. But this was not a normal touch, for he says the power has gone out from him. So, Peter's like, but Master, all the people are crowding around you. He's like, oh, this is different. Power left me. Jesus knows that power has gone out from him. I think this is really interesting because I believe that it was her faith that activated his power. Jesus plays no part in the healing, so it was her faith that activated his power. She believed that if Jesus could heal her, that if she could just get to him and touch him, that he would heal her. The fact that she got this close to Jesus before anyone noticed also shows us how chaotic this crowd was, because they would have recognized the woman and they would have tried to shoo her away as best they could. Now, I also think that this line of questioning that Jesus begins to use here, he went out of his way to avoid embarrassing the woman. Instead of continuing to say, who was it, who was it, who was it, he says, power left me. He puts the whole thing onto himself to help put the woman more at ease to come forward, because he wants to minister to more than just the physical healing. But remember, in the midst of this, Jesus is in a hurry to get to Jairus' house because his daughter was about to die. But the urgency of that doesn't stop Jesus from waiting here to minister to this woman. He sees her pain, and in this moment, that is more important to Jesus. Do you see that? This is what I really want us to see. So Jesus is on his way to go get Jairus' daughter and to heal her, right? But in this moment, it's more important for Jesus to stop and minister to the emotional needs of this woman who was just healed from the flow of blood. Jesus knows that whatever happens with Jairus' daughter is still within his control, but this woman's emotional needs right now are more important. Oftentimes, people think that God is far off and too busy for their problems, but I think this verse shows us differently. He stopped in the midst of a busy ministry and a big crowd to minister more deeply to this woman. We need to remember this about Jesus, and we need to act the same way. We need to press in not just for the physical pain and healing, but for the emotional pain and healing as well. Jesus was also always fully present with the one in front of him. If you notice Jesus really carefully, he's never in a hurry. Jesus is never in a hurry. He's always fully present with the one in front of him. So he's not pressing on here to the next task or the next need. In this case, Jairus' daughter, he wants to stop and minister to this woman. He's more concerned with her emotional well-being than he is with the next miracle of healing. And that's one of the pet peeves. I mean, we're in a healing movement. We're a healing movement, and I love that. But we've lost sight of this about Jesus. I just see people pressing on next healing, next healing, next healing, next healing. Line them up, get them all healed. Wait a minute. Whoa, stop. How are they doing? How is their well-being? How is their soul? We can minister to that too because Jesus does. And whatever happens to the next person in line, Jesus is already in control of that. So as we continue to exercise and be a healing movement, I want to encourage us to make sure that we're dealing with the emotional well-being of people as well, because it was important to Jesus. Verse 47. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. The woman seems to know that Jesus knows, and so she comes forward. Luke says that she is trembling, and the word translated there for trembling is the word associated with fear. But now here's what's interesting. Remember in the previous scene that I had mentioned, when Jesus heals the man with a legion of demons, it says the people had fear, and they asked Jesus to leave. Here the woman has fear, and she comes forward toward Jesus, because she has already seen and witnessed the care and the grace and the mercy of Jesus to stop and to wait for her. Now, this may have been an act of worship and thankfulness. She knows that she's been completely healed and her years of suffering are over. She knows that all of the social stigma that comes with that will be coming to an end. And so she might be coming forward as an act of worship and thankfulness. But she's still coming forward in a time when others are fleeing from Jesus. There's a chance that she was also going to come forward and beg for mercy because she knows that she touched Jesus, which made Jesus unclean. And so she might think that there's about to be a lynching of her because she touched Jesus. So she might have been begging for mercy. Certainly the religious leaders would want to take her out back and stone her for touching Jesus. Verse 48. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Not only does he not embarrass her, but he restores her by calling her daughter and sending her forth with his blessing of peace. The blessing of peace is all she really needed. The physical healing, yes, that was great. This blessing of peace, this is the thing that she really, really needed from Jesus. It's interesting to note that Jesus calls her daughter because she was probably older than Jesus. Jesus uses language here that is similar to back in Luke 7:50 when the sinful woman anointed him with perfume. Jesus confirms that it was her faith that had healed her. What's very interesting is how Jesus phrases this in the words that he uses. He says, "Your faith has saved you." Now the word in the original language is saved or rescued. Jesus seems to have in mind more than just healing. Now the word can have healing as part of its meaning, but the greater sense of the word that Jesus uses here is salvation. Her faith to come to Jesus not only got her physical healing, but it also got her salvation. Which is also why Jesus stopped, because he wanted to minister her one-on-one so that he could restore her emotionally, but so she could also have faith in him and what he just did. This is also important as we line up people to get healed. Do they know it was Jesus? Yeah. One of the things that bothers me about the healing movement these days is that people can get healed and walk out the door and they didn't know how it happened. Now the rest of the story, if we were to continue reading in Luke, as soon as Jesus gives this blessing of peace, another man shows up on the scene and says, "Jairus, your daughter is dead. You don't need to bother the master anymore." Imagine how Jairus felt in this moment. He's got Jesus. They're on their way. Jairus is thinking, "Oh, this is great. My daughter's going to be fine." But Jesus stops to minister to this woman, and in that time, his daughter dies. So in this moment, Jairus is probably conflicted and upset. But Jesus is not bothered one bit by this news. He simply says, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Jesus then continues on to Jairus' house. I have to imagine that last little bit of the journey, it doesn't really tell us how far it was. Jairus was probably a hot mess as they continued on that journey, right? Thinking his daughter is now gone, what's he going to do, and all of that. Jesus, knowing that everything is in his control, makes this trip with great confidence. And when Jesus arrives, of course, there's mourners and people weeping and waiting. He chases them all out. He just takes a few of the disciples with him. He just goes in. He takes the girl by the hand and says, "Get up." And she gets up. I want to summarize today by just making a few concluding points. As we look just at this story here, we can see Jesus always sees our pain. He saw the pain of the woman, even though she touched him from behind. He saw her pain, and he took the time to stop and to minister to that pain. Number two, Jesus will always take the time to be present with you. He is never in a hurry. You've probably heard this famous quote before. Someone once asked Dallas Willard, "What's the best thing I can do for spiritual maturity?" And Dallas Willard said, "Ruthlessly eliminate hurry." There's a book out now by that title. It's not by Dallas Willard. Somebody else wrote the book. But the title of the book is The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Jesus was never in a hurry. Which, that's a word to me because I feel like I'm always a day late and a dollar short and in a hurry somewhere, right? But Jesus was always present with the person in front of him. Number three, Jesus is as concerned about emotional well-being as he is with physical well-being. He could have said, "That woman's healed, I got to go," and just kept on moving. But he wanted to stop and make sure that that woman was right all the way through and that she was saved, as well as they could understand that in that moment. Number four, Jesus is in control of all the outcomes. He healed the woman and he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. He is in control of all of the outcomes. And number five, isn't Jesus amazing? All right. I will end there and invite the worship team up, and then we'll do some ministry time in a little bit.